September 12th, 1944. The dragon's teeth rose from the German earth like broken molars, concrete pyramids designed to stop exactly what was coming toward them now. Staff Sergeant James Harmon, 23 from Ohio, watched through his periscope as his Sherman tank approached the first line of fortifications that every American soldier had heard about since basic training. The Siegfried Line, the West Wall, the thing that was supposed to be impregnable. His tank commander's voice crackled through the intercom. "Driver, left track over the gap between those teeth. Gunner, traverse right, bunker at 2 o'clock. The Sherman lurched forward. Metal scraped concrete. The dragon's teeth, designed to gut the undercarriage of any tank that tried to cross them, passed beneath. They were through the first barrier. Behind Harmon's tank, dozens more were finding gaps, crushing obstacles, pushing into the fortification belt that stretched from the Netherlands to Switzerland. Engineers had blown holes, infantry had cleared pillboxes, and now American armor was pouring through breaches in the line that Hitler himself had once called the bulwark of the Reich. 600 miles to the east, in a concrete bunker complex hidden in the forests of East Prussia, Adolf Hitler sat at a conference table covered with maps. It was evening. The lamps cast harsh shadows across his face, making the tremor in his left hand more visible. He was 55 years old and looked 70. His uniform hung loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds since the July 20th assassination attempt. The blast that had nearly killed him had damaged his eardrums, leaving him partially deaf. His right arm still ached from the injuries. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the Wehrmacht High Command, stood at the map table with a pointer. He had just returned from a briefing on the Western Front. What he had to report would not improve the Führer's mood. "Mein Führer, American forces have reached the West Wall in strength. Multiple penetrations between Aachen and..." Hitler's head snapped up. "Penetrations?" Jodl hesitated. In the 18 months since Stalingrad, he had learned to read the warning signs. The sudden stillness, the way Hitler's right eye would begin to twitch, the peculiar flatness in his voice that preceded an eruption. "Local breaches, mein Führer. The line is holding in most sectors, but near Aachen, elements of the American First Army have pushed through the forward fortifications." "Push through." Hitler repeated the words as if tasting something foul. The West Wall was designed to withstand exactly this. Concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, obstacles that no tank can cross. And you tell me the Americans have simply pushed through? Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, shifted his weight. He had been standing for 3 hours. His feet ached, his back ached, everything ached. But Hitler never seemed to tire during these conferences, which could stretch past midnight. The fortifications in that sector were not fully manned, mein Führer. Many positions had been stripped of troops for the Eastern Front. The Americans brought overwhelming force to bear on a relatively weak. "Weak," Hitler's voice rose. "There is nothing weak about the West Wall. It is the strongest defensive line ever constructed. If it has been breached, it is because the commanders responsible lack the will to defend it properly." Jodl tried again. "The American armor is formidable, mein Führer. They're Sherman tanks, supported by artillery and air power." "Shermans." Hitler waved his trembling left hand dismissively. "Inferior machines. Our Panthers and Tigers are superior in every way. 1 Tiger is worth 10 Shermans." This was technically true. The German Tiger tank, with its 88mm gun and heavy armor, could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the American tank's 75mm gun was useless. But there were perhaps 50 operational Tigers on the entire Western Front. The Americans had thousands of Shermans. Mathematics mattered more than technical superiority. Jodl did not point this out. No one pointed out such things to Hitler anymore. Not after what had happened to the officers who had tried to kill him in July. Not after the trials and the executions and the films Hitler had ordered, made of men dying slowly on meat hooks. "What is the situation at Aachen?" Hitler asked. Aachen, the ancient city of Charlemagne, the first German city the Americans would reach. Hitler had already declared it a fortress, which meant it was to be held at all costs. No retreat, no surrender. Fight to the last man, the last bullet, the last breath. The Americans are approaching the outer defenses, Jodl said carefully. General Kirkling requests permission to withdraw his forces to more defensible positions within the city proper. Denied. Hitler's response was immediate. Aachen will be held. Every street, every building, the Americans will bleed for every meter. Do you understand? They must be shown that penetrating the West Wall means nothing, that taking German soil will cost them everything. In the forests outside Aachen, Sergeant Harmon's tank had stopped for the night. The crew sat on the engine deck, smoking, eating cold rations. They had made it through the Siegfried Line's first belt of fortifications. Tomorrow, they would push deeper. The day after that, they might reach Aachen itself. Harmon looked back at the dragon's teeth silhouetted against the darkening sky. They had seemed so formidable from a distance. Up close, they were just concrete. Well-made concrete, carefully placed, but still just concrete. And concrete could be bypassed, blown up, or simply driven around if you looked hard enough for the gaps. "You think Hitler knows we're here?" asked Private Morrison, the loader, 19 years old, from Tennessee. "He knows," said the tank commander, Lieutenant Brennan. "Question is what he's going to do about it." What Hitler was going to do about it was rage. Over the following days, as American forces widened their penetrations of the West Wall, as more tanks and infantry poured through the breaches, Hitler's fury at his commanders intensified. The transcripts of his military conferences, preserved by the stenographers who recorded every word, show a man increasingly divorced from reality. "The West Wall is impregnable if properly defended," he insisted during a conference on September 15th. "If the Americans have breached it, this is because of cowardice and defeatism among the commanders. I will not tolerate this. Officers who permit their sectors to be overrun will be court-martialed." Heinz Linger, Hitler's valet, watched these conferences from his position near the door. He had served Hitler for years, had seen him at his most triumphant, and now at his most desperate. The man raging at the map table bore little resemblance to the leader who had once seemed invincible. Hitler's left hand shook constantly now. His right leg dragged when he walked. His eyes had a feverish quality, and he slept only a few hours each night, sustained by the cocktail of drugs his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, injected daily. He would not accept that the West Wall could be breached, Linger later testified. In his mind, it was still 1940 when Germany was invincible. He would look at the maps showing American penetrations and insist they were temporary, that counterattacks would drive them back, that the line would hold. But the line was not holding. By late September, American forces had established multiple bridgeheads through the Siegfried Line. The 2nd Armored Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, had punched through near Geilenkirchen. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, was fighting through the fortifications around Aachen itself. The 3rd Armored Division was probing defenses further south. Hitler's response was to order counterattacks that existed only on paper. "Commit the Panzer Reserves," he commanded during a conference on September 20th. "Drive the Americans back across the border, restore the West Wall." "What Panzer Reserves?" The question hung unspoken in the room. The armored divisions that had once conquered Europe were shadows of themselves. Many had been destroyed in Normandy. Others were fighting desperate defensive battles in the east. The few available in the West were under strength, short of fuel, equipped with a mixture of German tanks and captured vehicles pressed into service out of desperation. General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most capable armor commanders, tried to explain reality. "Mein Führer, to mount an effective counterattack, we would need at least 3 full-strength panzer divisions, adequate fuel supplies, and air cover. We have none of these things. The Americans have complete air superiority. Any concentration of armor would be bombed before it could attack. Hitler's face flushed. Then we will attack at night. We will use the weather. We will do what is necessary. I will not accept defeatism. Defeatism. It was Hitler's favorite accusation now. Any officer who reported unfavorable facts was defeatist. Any commander who suggested withdrawal was defeatist. Anyone who acknowledged that Germany might actually lose the war was defeatist. And defeatism was treason, and treason meant death. October came. The weather turned cold and wet. American forces tightened their grip on Aachen. The city that Hitler had declared a fortress was being systematically destroyed, block by block, building by building. The German garrison, composed largely of Volksgrenadier divisions, hastily trained replacements, overedge men, boys from the Hitler Youth, fought with desperate courage but could not stop the American advance. On October 10th, Hitler received a report that American tanks had penetrated into the center of Aachen. His reaction, recorded by Colonel Nicholas von Below, his Luftwaffe adjutant, was telling. He did not speak for several minutes, von Below later wrote. He stared at the map, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Then he said very quietly, "Aachen is the city of Charlemagne, the first capital of the German Reich, and we are allowing Americans to desecrate it with their tanks." Then his voice rose. "This is treason. The commander of Aachen is a traitor. All of them are traitors. They are deliberately losing the war." The commander of Aachen, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, was not a traitor. He was a soldier trying to defend an indefensible position with inadequate forces against overwhelming odds. His men were fighting from cellars and ruins, armed with rifles and panzerfausts against American tanks and artillery. They were dying in large numbers for a cause that was already lost. On October 21st, 1944, Colonel Wilk surrendered. Aachen became the first German city to fall to the Allies. Of the garrison of approximately 5,000 men, fewer than 1,000 remained alive and unwounded. When Hitler received the news, he was at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. He had returned from East Prussia for meetings about the new wonder weapons, the V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, that he believed would still turn the tide of the war. General Jodl delivered the report of Aachen's fall during an evening conference. Hitler's response was recorded by multiple witnesses. "Wilk will be court-martialed and shot," he said. "Any officer who surrenders a fortress I have designated to be held will face the same fate. I will not tolerate this cowardice." Then, according to Jodl's testimony at Nuremberg, Hitler said something that revealed the depth of his delusion. "The loss of Aachen is temporary. When our counteroffensive begins, we will retake it. The Americans will be driven back across the Siegfried Line. They will be driven back across the Rhine. They will be driven into the sea." The counteroffensive Hitler referenced would indeed come, the Battle of the Bulge in December, Germany's last major offensive in the West. It would achieve initial surprise and make some gains before being crushed by American forces. But in October, as Hitler spoke these words, the idea that Germany could mount an offensive capable of reversing the Allied advance was fantasy. The Siegfried Line, the great wall that was supposed to protect the Reich, had been breached in dozens of places. American, British, and Canadian forces were on German soil. The Red Army was approaching from the east. Germany's cities were being bombed around the clock. The war was lost, but Hitler could not acknowledge this. To acknowledge it would be to admit that everything he had built, everything he had promised, was crumbling. So instead, he blamed his commanders. He blamed cowardice and defeatism. He blamed everyone except himself and the decisions that had led Germany to this point. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, observed one of these conferences in late October. He was living in a fantasy world, Speer later wrote. The maps on his table showed a Germany that no longer existed. He would move pins representing divisions that had been destroyed months ago. He would plan offensives with tanks that had no fuel and soldiers who were children or old men. And when anyone tried to tell him the truth, he would rage about traitors and defeatism. Back on the Siegfried Line, American forces continued to push forward. The breaches widened, more tanks came through, more infantry, more artillery. The fortifications that had taken years to build were being systematically reduced or bypassed. Sergeant Harmon's tank was part of the force that entered Aachen. He would later describe driving through streets lined with rubble, past buildings that were just shells, seeing German soldiers emerge from cellars with their hands up, looking exhausted and defeated. "We expected them to fight like fanatics," Harmon recalled in an interview decades later. "We'd been told they would never surrender, that they'd fight to the death for every inch of German soil. Some did. But most just looked relieved it was over. They were done. They knew they'd lost. But their Führer, 600 miles away in his bunker, did not know, or would not know. The distinction had ceased to matter. In November, Hitler moved back to the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. The military conferences continued. The rages continued. The delusions continued. He pored over maps of the Western Front, planning the great counteroffensive that would drive the Americans back, restore the Siegfried Line, save Germany. "When the offensive begins," he told his generals, "the Americans will panic. They are not real soldiers. They are shopkeepers and farmers in uniform. When we hit them with everything we have, they will break and run." The generals said nothing. They had learned that arguing was pointless and dangerous, so they nodded and took notes and went away to plan an offensive they knew would fail, using resources that barely existed to achieve objectives that were impossible. What Hitler had said when he saw, or rather, when he learned, that American tanks had broken through the Siegfried Line was essentially this: "It cannot be. It is the commander's fault. They are traitors and cowards. We will counterattack and drive them back. The line will hold because I say it will hold." Reality, as always, disagreed. By December, when the Battle of the Bulge began, the Siegfried Line had been breached along its entire length. American forces were preparing to cross the Rhine. The war was entering its final phase. Hitler would spend his last months in the Führer bunker beneath Berlin, moving phantom armies on maps, issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed, blaming everyone but himself for the catastrophe he had created. The man who had once conquered most of Europe could not accept that his conquests were being reversed, that his 1,000-year Reich would last only 12 years, that the tanks breaking through his defenses were harbingers of the end. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet tanks fought their way through Berlin's streets, Hitler shot himself in his bunker. Germany surrendered 8 days later. The Siegfried Line, that supposedly impregnable barrier, had been breached, bypassed, and rendered irrelevant. The dragon's teeth remained, concrete monuments to a defensive strategy that had failed, to a regime that had collapsed, to a leader who had refused to see reality until reality destroyed him. Sergeant Harmon survived the war. He returned to Ohio, married, raised children, worked in a factory. He rarely spoke about his experiences, but late in his life, he was interviewed for an oral history project. The interviewer asked him what he remembered most about breaking through the Siegfried Line. "The dragon's teeth," Harmon said. "From a distance, they looked so solid, so permanent, like they'd been there forever and would be there forever. But when you got close, you could see the gaps. You could see how to get through, and once you got through, you realized they were just concrete, just obstacles, and obstacles can always be overcome if you're willing to try." Hitler never understood this. He believed in the permanence of his fortifications, the invincibility of his armies, the righteousness of his cause. When American tanks broke through the Siegfried Line, he could not accept what it meant. So he blamed others, planned impossible counterattacks, and retreated further into delusion. The dragon's teeth are still there, scattered across the German countryside. Farmers plow around them, children play on them, tourists photograph them. They are reminders of a war that ended nearly 80 years ago, of a defensive line that failed, of a regime that fell. And somewhere in the historical record, preserved in conference transcripts and witness testimonies, are Hitler's words when he learned that his Great Wall had been breached. Denial, rage, blame, and ultimately, irrelevance. The tanks came through anyway. History moved forward, and all the fury of a dictator in a bunker could not stop it.